All right, Security Plus, and we're back here, y'all. Thanks, Security Plus. Y'all inspired me to create a whole new slide that I didn't have before to communicate the difference between risk appetite, risk capacity, risk tolerance, and risk profile. So, where did we just leave off? We just left off, and we were talking about risk profile. Okay, and what I realized is that I didn't have an example of a different risk profile to kind of communicate and bring this home what this dark green area was. So stop, pause for a second, grabbed a couple of graphs, and now we have risk profile. Okay, so this is an example, loan risk, this is an example loan mix, okay? The one on the left is one of my clients. The one on the right is Security Plus's loan mix. Your loan mix is the percentage of types of loans that you originate at a given date or that you have on your balance sheet at a given date as a percentage of the total loans, okay? So for this credit union on the left here, they have over about half of their loan portfolio is made up of used cars, okay? Only, not even, what is that, about a quarter, 1 to 4 family mortgages. Okay, so that credit union has a particular type of risk profile based on the types of assets or the type of loans that they have on their balance sheet as of month end 12/31/2018. Versus Security Plus here, you guys that have a more diverse, less concentrations in any one type of loan type. You all have, which I like, about 25% in 1 to 4 family mortgages. And I would imagine that some of this is both consumer mortgages as well as MBL mortgages, commercial real estate, and things of that nature. But then here you have less of a concentration in used cars. But you do more new cars than you do used cars. And I would probably say that's indicative of your membership base, their economic status, their salaries, things of that nature. This credit union on the left, they're in Florida, I think they're in Tallahassee. So you got a lot of college students, a lot of folks in that mid-range income that they just do a lot of used cars. And when I say risk profile, I'm not saying that this credit union on the left necessarily has a higher risk profile than you all, or vice versa. And so what do you mean by that? Well, my opinion, and I like making a distinction between an opinion and an assertion and facts. In my opinion, I have, I guess, a bias that used cars have a higher risk profile than 1 to 4 family mortgages. And in general, they're just create a lot more back office work for your credit union. They're constantly renewing and turning over and things of that nature. And sometimes folks just don't pay you back, things of that nature, right? So, however, this credit union on the left, that may be my opinion of their inherent risk, but the credit union on the left may have reduced their inherent risk by having good underwriting practices, good risk management controls, and things of that nature, okay? But just to get back to the risk profile, in my opinion, Security Plus has a more conservative or a lower risk profile than this credit union on the left. Why? Because you have a more diversified pool of loan types, and each one of those loan types has its own inherent risk characteristics involved, okay? All right, so that's risk profile. So let's back up. And so you have here this let's just say this institution here on the far left here has a risk profile less than the lower limit. And that means they're basically just sitting on the capital, sitting on the money. And in my opinion, they are too conservative. There's a way to be too conservative in the sense that you're not taking any risk. You're not lending to your membership. You're just sitting on the money because you're afraid of losses. And you're operating at a level that's outside of anyone's risk appetite. Next, we have the desired range. You got this range where you're in between your lower trigger and your upper trigger, or your upper risk tolerance and your lower risk tolerance, where your profile is in that, what we would call that Goldilocks space, okay? That's the desired range. It's that the risk profile is between the upper and lower ranges. Next, we have an escalation, where the risk profile is between the upper trigger limit and between your upper trigger limit and your upper limit. Okay. And that's an opportunity to take a step back and assess your limits. Maybe your policy limits are too conservative. Maybe things have changed. Again, I'm very, these limits and these triggers are opportunities for conversation, not opportunities to create these. That's where a lot of times, not saying that Security Plus, but where I run into a lot of issues with credit unions is where management looks at something like this and they feel as though there's going to be an erosion or a curtailment of their ability to move and operate as managers. If the board implements something like this, that's so far from what the situation or what we're trying to create here. We're trying to create opportunities, triggers to have conversations where you say, hey, is this where we need to be? And if it is, if everybody's in agreement, then let's march on. But without these limits, you can get outside of your capacity to operate and put the credit union at risk if you don't put these things in place. Okay. The next profile here says the profile is above the upper limit, where they triggered the upper limit, they're outside the trigger, they're outside the upper limit. And there needs to be some corrective action placed. You're about to go outside of being well capitalized. And then in this area here where the profile has gone outside of your capacity to sustain itself, and now the credit union is no longer viable because your risk profile exceeds your capacity. That would be me going to the roulette table, walking up to the manager and saying, hey, I only have $1,000 on me today, but I would like to get a credit limit of $100,000, knowing I don't have $100,000 to back that up, right? And I'm saying I'm gonna put $100,000 on black. Let's go. Well, I'm operating way outside my capacity to repay that if that ball falls on either the green or the red. And I'm going to be in trouble then, right? And so, again, you have to operate within your capacity. And what we're going to be doing, I want you to understand these. One of the reasons why we're doing this now is so that you as the user that's taking in this content can pause, rewind, look at it again a bunch of times if you need to before the actual strategic planning day, so that when we get there, we're not discussing the topics and we're in a sense that we're not teaching the concepts. We can talk about the concepts in the context of Security Plus and how we can either decide to implement some of these risk management mechanisms or just discuss them within the context of Security Plus, okay? So hopefully these things were helpful. We're going to talk about Security Plus's desired risk profile more during the strategic planning, during my portion. Where do we want to be? What do we want our risk profile to look like? And how do we get there based on our strategic plan and our budget and get all these different kinds? Because once you're going to love it. Once you get your appetite statement, establish your risk tolerances, you're going to have better communication between the board and the management will have better communication between themselves and the loan officers. It's almost like, imagine if we got a seafood restaurant and we need fish, but our fishermen keep on bringing us crabs and oysters. Well, if they going out and spending all their time catching shrimp, crabs and oysters, when we really need some red snapper and some trout, they're wasting their time because we're not going to put that on the menu anyway. In the same way, if we're able to communicate to our lenders, these are the type of loans that fit within our risk profile that we have an appetite for, we can better use their time to go after those type of loans, and we won't be throwing those fish back in the form of denied loan approvals. Okay, hopefully all that made sense. Also, just if you're listening to this and you just need to give me a holler, give me a call, I'm going to provide you all with my information. Email me, call me. Between now and the session, let's just chat. If you need me to distill it a little bit more, break it down a little bit more, give me a call, no charge, and we can talk about it to make sure you really understand these concepts. So let's look at some example risk appetite and risk tolerance statements. Some example risk appetite and risk tolerance statements. And so for example, here we got example MBL, member business lending, business unit risk appetite statement. So ideally, we want to get an overall risk appetite statement for your credit union, but then that's going to need to be transferred to the different business unit. Each division, each department needs to have some kind of risk appetite statement and tolerance levels set for itself. So we are willing to lend to established businesses whose financial statements reflect a paper grade of at least C+. And we would have to establish what that means, what's a C, what's a B, and things of that nature. But let's just for example, at least a C+, okay? An example of a risk challenge would say, member business lending net losses will be less than X of our average balances. So that's our tolerance levels. If we step outside that, then we need to take a step back and say, well, maybe we need to change it from C+ to B-, because we're lending money to people with C+, and maybe we aren't getting a good enough rate to overcome that risk premium. Perhaps we need to pull back. Okay. Again, risk appetite statement needs to be communicated into a tolerance level, and then those tolerances get communicated to the business leaders or that particular manager so that they can understand what we're attempting to do. Okay. Let's look at another one for liquidity risk. We manage our liquidity position to ensure that we can meet our cash obligations even under liquidity stress tests. So an example would be, we maintain a liquidity coverage of at least 200% of a likely scenario and at least 110% of a stress scenario. And you would look at those different scenarios, and they would get reported to the board on a monthly basis. And if you fall outside of that, that would be a trigger to do what? Raise your hand and say, hey, we're outside our policy, or we've gone outside our tolerance. What's happening? Well, we had a great month. We lent a lot of money out, and so we didn't have as much liquid assets available. That's why that happened, so on and so forth. Again, these triggers create an opportunity for discussion. These trigger points allow the board to not be involved in day-to-day operational issues that management should be involved in, but speak to it more strategically. You set these guideposts for management to operate within, and then if we go outside of it, we hit a trigger, gets reported to the board, and then we have a discussion about it. Here's another one that you may not think should be an appetite, but this is one of my more favorite ones. It's around talent risk. Talent risk is so important to credit unions because if you don't have the right people in place, and if you can't retain those individuals, then you can't achieve your strategic objectives. You can't row the boat in any direction if you don't have people rowing, right? So we strive to establish and maintain a talented workforce, especially through professional development and retention of high potential employees. Well, we got to quantify that. How do we retain those individuals? Well, here's a tolerance. Retention rate of high potential employees will be at least 90%. How does that work out in an annual basis? Well, you have your annual review process, okay? and maybe you have a grading level of 1 to 5, five being the highest level, and you have a certain, say in your just for easy numbers, in a given year you had 10 individuals that were rated high potential. Well, in the next year, the goal would be to retain at least 9 of those 10 employees. Because I would be willing to say, and I've noticed this just through a lot of credit, those 10 high potential employees, they do a lot more rowing than other individuals, and high potential employees are better managers of other individuals, and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, this is just a random aside. I was talking with a CEO the other day. They merged with another credit union, and they had 100 employees. And they went through this process. I think he read this book called Hiring for Attitude. I forget the name of the author. But he went through that process, hiring for attitude, and he said after 9 months, he was able to take those 100 employees from 100 down to 70. Okay. Now with that core 70 group, he has people with the right attitude, all rowing in the same direction. And now they have more resources to reward, bonus, and do, random nice things for those 70 employees than they could have done with that 100. And those 30 employees that weren't there, well, those were the folks that were, keeping morale down and just not pushing in the same direction. So again, you want to make sure that you think about risk appetite and risk tolerances, not just in the context of credit risk and liquidity risk, some of those hard topics, but you also want to think about it in some of those softer topics around strategic risk and and talent risk as well.